Maria woke up every morning to the sound of birds singing outside her small adobe house. The sun would peek through the thin curtains, painting golden lines across the wooden floor her husband Carlos had built with his own hands. She loved these quiet moments before the day began, when everything felt perfect in her little world. Their ranch wasn't much to look at from the outside. Just a simple house with thick walls that kept them cool in summer and warm in winter. Carlos had painted it white with blue trim, the same colors Maria remembered from her childhood home in Mexico. Behind the house stood a small barn where they kept their 3 horses and a handful of chickens that provided fresh eggs every day. Maria had been married to Carlos for 3 years now, and each day felt like a blessing. He was nothing like the men her mother had warned her about. Carlos listened when she spoke, helped her with the heavy work, and never raised his voice in anger. When she cooked traditional meals from her homeland, he would close his eyes and smile, telling her it reminded him of sunshine and warmth. The land around their home stretched for miles in every direction. Red rocks rose from the desert floor like ancient giants, and cacti bloomed with bright flowers when the rains came. Maria had learned to love this harsh but beautiful place. It was so different from the green valleys where she grew up, but it had become home because Carlos was there. Every morning, Maria would step outside to feed the chickens. They knew her voice and would come running, their feathers ruffling in the cool morning breeze. She would scatter corn from her apron pocket and laugh as they fought over the biggest pieces. Carlos always said her laugh was the most beautiful sound in the whole territory. After the chickens were fed, Maria would walk to their small garden. She had worked hard to make vegetables grow in this dry soil. Carlos had helped her dig a well and build channels to bring water to the plants. Now they had tomatoes, peppers, and beans growing in neat rows. Maria felt proud every time she picked fresh vegetables for their dinner table. The nearest town was a 2-hour ride away, but Maria didn't mind the isolation. She had Carlos, and that was enough. Sometimes travelers would stop by their ranch, looking for water or a place to rest their horses. Maria always welcomed them with food and kindness. Carlos would share news from town or help fix a broken wagon wheel. These visits brought excitement to their quiet life. On Sundays, they would ride together to the small church in town. Maria wore her best dress, the blue one with tiny flowers that her mother had sewn for her wedding. Carlos would put on his clean shirt and comb his dark hair until it shone. They made a handsome couple, and Maria felt proud walking beside him. The other Mexican families in town always greeted Maria warmly. She would chat with the women about recipes and gardens, while Carlos talked with the men about cattle and weather. These Sunday visits reminded Maria that she wasn't alone in this new land. There were others who understood her language and her ways. Life was simple but good. Maria would wake before sunrise to make fresh tortillas for breakfast. The smell of cooking masa would fill the house and wake Carlos gently. They would eat together as the sun came up, planning their day and sharing their dreams. Carlos wanted to buy more land and raise cattle. Maria dreamed of having children who would run through the house and fill it with laughter. In the evenings, they would sit on their front porch and watch the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Carlos would play his guitar and sing old songs while Maria worked on her sewing. Sometimes they would dance in the moonlight. With only the stars as witnesses to their happiness, Maria felt truly blessed during those peaceful days. She had escaped the poverty of her childhood and found love with a good man. Carlos respected her traditions and never tried to change who she was. When she cooked the spicy foods of her homeland, he ate them with enthusiasm. When she spoke Spanish, he tried to learn new words. When she missed her family, he held her close and promised to take her for a visit someday. Their little ranch felt like paradise. Maria had her garden, her chickens, and her beloved husband. The future stretched ahead of them like an endless blue sky, full of possibilities and hope. She couldn't imagine anything disturbing their perfect peace, but happiness, Maria would soon learn, could be as fragile as the desert flowers that bloomed for just a few days after the rain. She had no way of knowing that Carlos had been writing letters to his family back east, telling them about his new life and his Mexican wife. She didn't know that his parents had been planning a visit. packing their bags and their prejudices. For the long journey west, Carlos hadn't mentioned much about his family. Maria knew his parents lived far away in a place called Boston, where the buildings were tall and the winters were cold. She knew they had money and education, things Carlos had left behind when he came west to start his own life. But she didn't know about their strong opinions on who their son should marry. The peaceful days continued, with Maria blissfully unaware that her world was about to change forever. She tended her garden, fed her chickens, and loved her husband with all her heart. The desert bloomed around their little ranch, and life felt as perfect as a warm summer evening. Soon, very soon, strangers would arrive at their door with cold eyes and cruel words. But for now, in these last precious days of innocence, Maria was simply a young woman in love, building a life with the man of her dreams under the endless Arizona sky. The dust cloud appeared on the horizon just after noon on a Tuesday in late September. Maria was hanging laundry on the line behind their house when she noticed it. She shielded her eyes from the sun and watched as a fancy black carriage pulled by two fine horses made its way toward their ranch. This wasn't like the usual travelers who passed through their land. This carriage looked expensive, the kind rich people from back east would use. Carlos came running from the barn, his face a mixture of excitement and worry. He had been expecting this visit but hadn't told Maria exactly when his parents would arrive. Now, seeing the nervous way he wiped his hands on his pants and tried to smooth down his hair, Maria felt her stomach twist with anxiety. "Those are my parents," Carlos said quietly, his voice sounding different than usual. "They've come a long way to meet you." Maria's heart started beating faster. She had been looking forward to meeting Carlos's family, but something in his tone made her worried. She quickly smoothed her dress and checked that her hair was neat. She wanted to make a good impression on the people who had raised the man she loved. The carriage stopped in front of their house with a creak of leather and wood. The driver, a stern-looking man in a dark suit, climbed down and opened the door. First came a tall, thin woman dressed in black silk that looked completely out of place in the desert heat. Her gray hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin on her face. Behind her stepped a heavy-set man with a thick mustache and cold blue eyes that reminded Maria of winter ice. These were Eleanor and Benjamin, Carlos's parents, though Maria didn't know their names yet. They looked around the ranch with expressions that made it clear they were not impressed. Eleanor lifted her skirt slightly to avoid the dust, while Benjamin pulled out a handkerchief to cover his nose as if the clean desert air offended him. Carlos rushed forward to greet them, but even Maria could see the stiffness in their embraces. It was like watching strangers pretend to be family. Eleanor barely touched Carlos when she hugged him, and Benjamin's pat on the back seemed more like a duty than affection. "So this is where you've been hiding," Eleanor said, her voice carrying an accent that made every word sound sharp and cutting. Her eyes swept over the simple adobe house, the small garden, and the chickens pecking in the yard. How ... rustic. Maria stepped forward with a warm smile, ready to welcome her husband's family into their home. She had prepared special food and cleaned the house until it sparkled. In her culture, guests were treated like royalty, no matter how unexpected their arrival. "Welcome to our home," Maria said in her accented English, offering her hand in greeting. "I am Maria. Carlos has told me so much about you." But instead of taking her hand, Eleanor stepped back as if Maria carried some kind of disease. Benjamin looked her up and down like she was livestock at a market, his expression growing colder by the second. The silence stretched uncomfortably, until Carlos finally spoke. "Mother, father, this is my wife Maria. Maria, these are my parents." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes, we received your letter about your ... marriage." The way she said the word made it sound like something shameful. "We thought perhaps you were going through a phase, but clearly this situation requires our immediate attention." Maria felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she tried to stay polite. "Please, come inside. You must be tired from your long journey. I have prepared food and cool water." "How thoughtful," Benjamin said, though his tone suggested he found it anything but thoughtful. "I suppose we should see what passes for hospitality in these parts." As they walked toward the house, Maria heard Eleanor whisper loudly to Benjamin, "Look at this place. It's like he's living with savages. And that woman, did you see how dark she is? What will people back home say?" The words hit Maria like a slap, but she forced herself to keep walking. She had heard cruel comments about her skin color before, but never from family. Never from people who were supposed to love her husband, and, by extension, her. Inside the house, things only got worse. Eleanor examined everything with obvious disapproval. She ran her finger along the wooden table Carlos had made, checking for dust. She looked at Maria's colorful woven blankets and traditional pottery as if they were evidence of some terrible crime. "Carlos," Benjamin said, settling into a chair that creaked under his weight, "we need to discuss your future. This little adventure has gone on long enough." "Adventure?" Carlos asked, his voice sounding confused and hurt. "Father, this is my life. Maria is my wife, and this is our home." Eleanor laughed, but there was no warmth in the sound. "Wife?" "Carlos, surely you understand that what you have here is not a real marriage. This woman is not suitable for someone of your background and education. She's Mexican, for goodness sake." Maria stood in the doorway to the kitchen, holding a pitcher of water, feeling like an unwelcome stranger in her own home. The casual way Eleanor dismissed her entire existence made her hands shake with anger and hurt. "I love Maria," Carlos said firmly, and for a moment Maria felt hope bloom in her chest. "She's a good woman and she makes me happy." "Love?" Benjamin scoffed. "You think you love her because you've been isolated out here, away from proper society? Once you come back to Boston with us, you'll remember what real women are like." Educated women? White women? The racist words hung in the air like poison. Maria had never heard such open hatred expressed so casually, as if her very existence was somehow wrong. She wanted to speak up, to defend herself and her heritage, but the shock left her speechless. "I'm not going anywhere," Carlos said, but Maria noticed his voice wasn't as strong as before. "This is my home now." "Nonsense," Eleanor said, standing up and brushing imaginary dirt from her dress. "We've already spoken to your uncle about a position in his banking firm. You'll have a proper house in a proper neighborhood, and we'll find you a suitable wife from a good family." "I already have a wife," Carlos said, but the words came out weak and uncertain. Eleanor looked at Maria with such disgust that it made her feel small and dirty. "That can be remedied easily enough. These frontier marriages hardly count as legal anyway. A simple annulment, and this whole embarrassing episode will be forgotten." Maria felt the world spinning around her. These people talked about erasing her marriage, her love, her entire life as if she wasn't even in the room, as if she didn't matter at all. The worst part was seeing the uncertainty growing in Carlos's eyes, the way he looked between his parents and her as if weighing their words. That night, as Eleanor and Benjamin settled into the guest room, Maria lay awake listening to Carlos toss and turn beside her. She could feel him pulling away from her, not physically but emotionally. The seeds of doubt his parents had planted were already beginning to grow, and Maria realized with growing terror that her perfect life was starting to crumble like sand in the desert wind. 3 weeks had passed since Eleanor and Benjamin arrived at the ranch, and the tension in the house had grown thick enough to cut with a knife. Every morning brought new rules and demands that made Maria feel like a prisoner in her own home. She could no longer speak Spanish, even when talking to herself while cooking. Her traditional dresses were hidden away, replaced by the plain gray dress Eleanor had bought for her in town. The worst part was watching Carlos change. Day by day he became more distant, more uncertain. When his parents criticized Maria's cooking, he stayed silent. When they complained about her accent, he looked away. When they suggested she was holding him back from his true potential, he no longer argued as strongly as before. Maria tried to be patient. She told herself that family was complicated, that Carlos was caught between two worlds he loved. But each silent moment from her husband felt like another small betrayal, another crack in the foundation of their marriage. On this particular evening, Carlos had ridden to town to meet with a cattle buyer. The business trip would keep him away overnight, something that had never bothered Maria before. But now, left alone with Eleanor and Benjamin, she felt like a deer surrounded by wolves. She was in the kitchen washing dishes from dinner when Eleanor entered. The older woman moved quietly, which was unusual. Normally, Eleanor announced her presence with complaints or criticism. The silence felt dangerous. "Maria," Eleanor said, her voice deceptively calm, "we need to have a conversation." Maria dried, her hands on her apron, and turned around. Eleanor stood in the doorway with Benjamin right behind her. Something in their expressions made Maria's heart start racing. They looked like people who had made a decision, and Maria had a terrible feeling. She wouldn't like what they had planned. "Yes?" Maria asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "This charade has gone on long enough," Benjamin said, stepping into the kitchen. "You've had your fun playing house with our son, but it's time to face reality." Eleanor moved closer, and Maria noticed she was holding something behind her back. "Carlos is too kind-hearted to do what needs to be done, so we're going to help him make the right choice." "I don't understand," Maria said, though a cold fear was spreading through her chest. She took a step backward, but the kitchen was small, and there was nowhere to go. "You understand perfectly," Eleanor said coldly. "You're not stupid, despite what your kind usually are. You know you don't belong here. You know Carlos deserves better than a Mexican peasant who will only drag him down." The cruel words stung, but Maria lifted her chin with dignity. "Carlos loves me. We are married in the eyes of God and the law." Benjamin laughed harshly. "Love? You think what Carlos feels is love? It's pity, girl. Pity and loneliness made him settle for someone like you. But now that we're here to guide him back to his senses, he's starting to see the truth." Eleanor brought her hands forward, revealing a pair of large scissors that gleamed in the lamplight. "We're going to help you understand your place. Help you see what you really are." Maria's eyes went wide with terror. "What are you doing?" "Put those away." "Oh, still," Eleanor commanded, but Maria was already backing away, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Benjamin moved to block the kitchen doorway while Eleanor advanced with the scissors. "This will go easier if you don't fight us," he said. "We're actually doing you a favor, helping you accept reality." Maria pressed herself against the wall, looking desperately for another way out. But the kitchen window was too small, and Benjamin's bulk filled the doorway completely. She was trapped. "Please," Maria whispered, "don't do this. Carlos will be angry when he finds out." "Carlos will thank us," Eleanor said, reaching out to grab a handful of Maria's long black hair. "Once he sees you for what you really are." Maria tried to pull away, but Eleanor's grip was surprisingly strong. The older woman had clearly planned this attack carefully. With one quick motion, Eleanor brought the scissors up and cut through a thick section of Maria's hair. The sound of the blades closing was like a gunshot in the small kitchen. Maria felt the weight of her severed hair fall away, and she cried out in shock and horror. Her beautiful long hair, which had taken years to grow, was gone in an instant. "There," Eleanor said with satisfaction, "that's better. Much more appropriate for someone of your station," but she wasn't finished. Eleanor continued cutting, grabbing sections of hair and chopping them off roughly, carelessly. Maria tried to fight back, but Benjamin grabbed her arms and held them behind her back. She could only stand there and sob as her hair fell to the floor around her feet like dark snow. "Stop crying," Benjamin said roughly. "This is what you deserve for trying to rise above your place." When Eleanor finally finished with the scissors, Maria's once beautiful hair hung in uneven chunks around her shoulders. She looked like she had been attacked by wild animals. But the nightmare wasn't over yet. Eleanor disappeared for a moment and returned with a bucket of ash from the fireplace and dirt from the garden. Maria's eyes widened in horror as she realized what they planned to do next. "This will help you remember what you are," Eleanor said, scooping up a handful of the gray ash. "A dirty Mexican peasant who has no business pretending to be a lady." Before Maria could react, Eleanor smeared the ash across her cheeks and forehead. The gritty mixture stung her eyes and filled her nose with the smell of old fires. Benjamin held her still while Eleanor continued. rubbing dirt and ash into her face until Maria looked like she had been rolling in the dust. "Perfect," Eleanor said, stepping back to admire her cruel work. "Now you look like what you really are, a savage, a nobody." Maria stood there trembling, covered in dirt and ash, her beautiful hair destroyed. She felt humiliated and broken, but underneath the shame, a fierce anger was growing. These people had no right to treat her this way. No right to destroy her dignity and try to make her feel less than human. "Carlos will never forgive you for this," Maria said, her voice shaking. With rage and hurt, Eleanor laughed coldly. "Carlos will see that we've done him a favor. When he comes home and sees you like this, he'll realize what kind of woman he married, what kind of mistake he made. You're not welcome in his house anymore," Benjamin added. "Pack your things and leave. Go back to whatever hovel you came from. If you're still here when Carlos returns, we'll tell him you attacked us. Who do you think he'll believe? His educated, respectable parents or a wild Mexican woman covered in dirt?" The threat hung in the air like poison. Maria knew they were right about one thing. Carlos had been changing, becoming more distant. Would he believe his parents' lies? Would he look at her covered in ash and see what they wanted him to see? She couldn't take that chance. She couldn't bear to see doubt in Carlos's eyes, couldn't stand the thought that he might believe she had become something shameful. With her last shred of dignity, Maria walked past them toward the door. "Remember," Eleanor called after her, "you brought this on yourself by trying to be something you're not." Maria stepped out into the desert night, her destroyed hair blowing. In the wind, ash still clinging to her tear-stained face. Behind her, she could hear Eleanor and Benjamin already making plans, deciding what lies they would tell Carlos when he returned. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, dark and dangerous under the starless sky. But anything was better than staying in that house of hatred for one more moment. Maria began walking, not knowing where she was going, only knowing she had to get away from the cruelty that had destroyed her world in a single evening. Maria had been walking through the desert for hours when her legs finally gave out. The moon had disappeared behind thick clouds, leaving her stumbling through darkness, over rocks and through thorny bush that tore at her dress. Her throat felt like sandpaper, and the ash on her face had mixed with tears and sweat to create a muddy mess that made her skin itch and burn. She had lost one of her shoes somewhere in the darkness, and her bare foot was bleeding from stepping on sharp stones. Every step became harder than the last until finally she simply couldn't take another one. Maria collapsed beside what looked like a small pool of water, though in the darkness she couldn't be sure if it was real or just her desperate mind playing tricks on her. The water was real. Maria crawled to the edge and cupped the cool liquid in her shaking hands, drinking greedily despite the muddy taste. She splashed some on her face, trying to wash away the ash and dirt that Eleanor had rubbed into her skin. But even as the physical dirt came away, she couldn't wash away the shame and humiliation that had been burned into her soul. As she sat by the water's edge, Maria began to cry again. Not the angry tears she had shed while walking, but deep, broken sobs that came from somewhere deep in her chest. Everything she had built, everything she had loved, was gone. Her marriage, her home, her dignity, all destroyed in one terrible evening by people who saw her as less than human. The worst part was the doubt that had started growing in her mind. What if Eleanor and Benjamin were right? What if Carlos really was just settling for her out of loneliness? What if he would be relieved to find her gone when he returned home? The questions tortured her more than the physical pain of her injuries. Maria must have fallen asleep beside the water because the next thing she knew, something was nudging her shoulder. She opened her eyes to find the sun just beginning to rise, painting the desert in shades of gold and pink. Standing over her was the largest woman she had ever seen. The woman was tall, taller than most men Maria knew, with broad shoulders and strong arms that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. Her skin was bronzed by years in the desert sun, and her long black hair was braided with small silver ornaments that caught the morning light. She wore traditional Apache clothing made of soft leather decorated with intricate beadwork, and her Dark eyes held a mixture of concern and anger as she looked down at Maria's battered appearance. This was Nalnish, though Maria didn't know her name yet. What Maria could see immediately was strength. Not just physical strength, though that was obvious, but something deeper. A power that came from knowing exactly who she was and refusing to let anyone make her feel ashamed of it. What happened? To you, sister? Nalnish asked in accented English, her voice deep and musical. The word sister caught Maria off guard. She hadn't expected kindness from the stranger, especially not after the cruelty she had just experienced. Maria tried to sit up but winced as pain shot through her body. Every muscle ached from the long night of walking and sleeping on the hard ground. Nalnish immediately knelt beside her, offering a strong hand to help her into a sitting position. Die. Maria started to speak, then stopped. How could she explain what had happened? How could she put into words the humiliation and betrayal she had suffered? I had to leave my home, she finally managed to say. Nalnish studied Maria's face carefully. Even though Maria had tried to wash off the ash and dirt, traces still remained in her hairline and around her ears. Her hair hung in the uneven chunks that Eleanor's scissors had created, and her dress was torn and stained from her journey through the desert. Someone did this to you, Nalnish said. It wasn't a question. Her experienced eyes could read the signs of deliberate cruelty. Someone hurt you and drove you from your home. Maria nodded, fresh tears starting to flow. Something about this stranger's gentle tone and concerned expression broke down the walls she had built around her pain. My husband's parents, she whispered. They said I wasn't good enough for their son. They said I was dirty and savage and that I didn't belong in their family. Nalnish's expression darkened like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Her jaw tightened, and Maria could see anger building in her eyes. But it wasn't anger directed at Maria. It was fury at the people who had done this to her. They cut your hair, Nalnish observed, reaching out to touch one of the uneven strands. They put ash on your face to mark you as something shameful? Yes, Maria said, surprised that this woman understood so quickly what had been done to her. They said it would show my husband what I really was, what I deserved. For a moment, Nalnish was quiet. She stood up and walked to the edge of the water pool, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of someone who had seen this kind of cruelty before. I know this trick, she said. White people have used it on my people for generations. They try to make us ashamed of who we are by covering us with dirt and cutting our hair. They think if they can make us look broken, we will believe we are broken. Maria looked up at her in surprise. She hadn't thought about it that way, but Nalnish was right. The hair cutting and face marking weren't random acts of cruelty. They were calculated attacks designed to destroy her sense of self-worth. But you are not broken, Nalnish continued, turning back to face Maria. You are still the same woman you were before they touched you. Your worth doesn't come from how they see you. It comes from who you choose to be. The words hit Maria like cool water on a burn. For the first time since the attack, she felt a tiny spark of hope flickering in her chest. This stranger saw her as a person worthy of respect, not as the shameful thing Eleanor and Benjamin had tried to make her believe she was. Nalnish walked back to Maria and extended her hand again. Can you stand? My camp is not far from here. You need food and rest and proper care for your wounds? Maria took the offered hand and allowed herself to be pulled to her feet. Standing next to Nalnish, she felt small and fragile, but also protected. There was something about this woman that made Maria feel safe for the first time in weeks. Why are you helping me? Maria asked as they began walking slowly away from the water. You don't even know me. Nalnish smiled, and the expression transformed her stern face into something warm and beautiful. I know enough. I know you are a woman who has been treated badly by people who think they are better than you. I know you are brave enough to walk alone through the desert rather than accept their cruelty. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. As they walked, Nalnish told Maria about herself. She was a healer and a warrior among her people, someone others came to when they needed justice or protection. She had spent her life fighting against the kind of hatred that had driven Maria from her home. People like your husband's parents, Nalnish explained. They think they can destroy us by making us believe their lies about who we are. But we are not what they say we are. We are who we choose to be, and we are stronger than they will ever understand. Maria listened to these words and felt something she had almost forgotten: pride. Pride in her heritage, in her strength, in her refusal to accept the cruel treatment she had received. As the sun climbed higher in the sky and Nalnish's camp came into view, Maria began to believe that maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't over yet. For 2 days, Maria rested in Nalnish's camp, slowly healing both her body and her spirit. The Apache woman had treated her cuts with healing herbs, braided her damaged hair into a style that looked intentional rather than broken, and fed her nourishing stews that brought strength back to her tired body. More importantly, Nalnish had listened to her story without judgment, letting Maria speak about her pain until the words no longer felt like poison in her throat. On the morning of the 3rd day, Maria woke to find Nalnish preparing for a journey. The tall woman was packing supplies into leather bags and checking the straps on her horse's saddle. Her movements were purposeful and determined, like someone who had made an important decision during the night. "Where are you going?" Maria asked. Though something in her heart already knew the answer, Nalnish looked up from her preparations, and Maria saw a fire burning in her dark eyes that hadn't been there before. "We are going to your ranch," she said simply. "It's time for your husband's parents to face the consequences of what they've done." Maria felt her stomach clench with fear and anxiety. "No, you don't understand. They're dangerous. They have power and money, and they'll find a way to hurt you too. Besides, Carlos might be back by now, and if he believes their lies about me, then it's better we find out now what kind of man you married," Nalnish interrupted gently but firmly. "And as for his parents being dangerous, they attacked a woman half their size in the safety of her own home. That doesn't make them powerful, it makes them cowards." Nalnish finished packing and turned to face Maria completely. "You have a choice to make, sister. You can stay here and let them win, let them drive you away from your home and your life forever, or you can come with me and stand up for yourself. Show them that you are not the broken thing they tried to make you believe you were." The words hit Maria like a challenge. For days, she had been thinking of herself as a victim, someone who had suffered terrible treatment and needed to hide from the world. But Nalnish was offering her something different, a chance to reclaim her dignity and fight back against the cruelty she had endured. "You're coming with me," Nalnish said, and there was something in the way she said it that made it sound less like a request and more like a statement of fact. It was the same tone someone might use when declaring that the sun would rise or that water would flow downhill. Inevitable and unquestionable, Maria looked into Nalnish's eyes and saw her own reflection there. Not the ashamed, broken woman Eleanor and Benjamin had tried to create, but someone strong and worthy of respect. Someone who deserved to have her voice heard and her dignity restored. "Yes," Maria said quietly, then stronger, "yes, I'm coming with you." They rode toward the ranch in the early afternoon, when the sun was high and the shadows were short. Nalnish sat tall on her horse, her presence commanding even in the vast emptiness of the desert. Maria rode beside her on a gentle mare that Nalnish had insisted she borrow. With each mile they covered, Maria felt her courage growing stronger. As they approached the ranch, Maria could see Carlos's horse in the corral, which meant he had returned from his business trip. Her heart began racing with a mixture of hope and terror. What had Eleanor and Benjamin told him about her disappearance? Did he believe their lies? Was he worried about her, or was he relieved that the problem of his Mexican wife had solved itself? They could see people moving around near the house as they got closer. Eleanor was hanging laundry on the line, Maria's laundry, she realized with a shock. The older woman was washing and hanging up the clothes as if she had already taken Over the household completely, Nalnish brought her horse to a stop just outside the yard and dismounted with fluid grace. Even from a distance, her imposing figure commanded attention. She stood nearly 6 feet tall, and her traditional Apache clothing and confident bearing made her look like a warrior from the old stories. Eleanor noticed them first. The older woman dropped the shirt she was hanging and stared at the approaching figures with obvious alarm. She called out sharply to someone inside the house, and within moments Benjamin emerged, followed by Carlos. Carlos's face went through a series of expressions when he saw Maria, first surprise, then relief, then confusion as he took in her appearance, and the imposing woman beside her. Maria studied his face carefully, looking for signs of whether he had believed his parents' version of events. "Maria," Carlos called out, starting to walk toward them. "Where have you been?" "My parents said you had attacked them and run off into the desert. We were worried sick about you." The lie hit Maria like a physical blow. Just as Eleanor and Benjamin had threatened, they had twisted the story to make her the villain. But before she could respond, Nalnish stepped forward, and her presence seemed to fill the entire yard. "Your parents," Nalnish said, her voice carrying clearly across the space between them, "are liars?" The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Eleanor gasped audibly, and Benjamin's face turned red with indignation. But Nalnish wasn't finished. "They attacked your wife in her own home?" she continued, each word precise and cutting. "They cut her hair like she was an animal being punished. They rubbed ash and dirt on her face to humiliate her. Then they drove her out into the desert. Night, where she could have died." Carlos looked between Nalnish and his parents, confusion and growing alarm on his face. "That's not—" "They said she attacked them. They said she went crazy and—" "Look at her," Nalnish commanded, gesturing toward Maria. "Look at your wife and see the evidence of what they did." For the first time, Carlos really looked at Maria. He saw her roughly cut hair, the fading marks on her face where the ash had been rubbed in, the torn dress and bandaged foot. Most importantly, he saw the hurt in her eyes, not the wild anger his parents had described, but the deep pain of someone who had been betrayed by people who should have protected her. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice shrill with panic. "Don't listen to these people, Carlos. This savage woman is obviously lying to protect her friend. You know, Maria was becoming unstable. We were only trying to help her see reason." Nalnish turned her attention to Eleanor, and the older woman actually took a step backward. There was something in Nalnish's eyes that made it clear she was not someone to be trifled with. "I have lived in this desert for more than 40 years, Nalnish said, her voice deadly calm. "I have seen soldiers and settlers and all manner of people who thought they could come here and impose their will on others. But I have never seen cruelty as calculated and vicious as what you did to this woman in her own home." Benjamin tried to bluster his way back into control of the situation. "Now see here, you have no right to come onto private property and make accusations. I don't know what lies Maria has told you, but—" "You're coming with me," Nalnish said, the same words she had spoken to Maria, but this time they carried a completely different meaning. This time they were a promise of justice, a declaration that the time for hiding behind lies and excuses was over. The confrontation had begun. And Maria realized that, for the first time in weeks, she wasn't alone in fighting for her dignity and her place in the world. Nalnish stepped closer to the group, and her imposing presence seemed to make the very air around them feel heavier. Eleanor and Benjamin instinctively moved backward, but there was nowhere for them to hide from the truth that was about to unfold. Carlos stood frozen between his wife and his parents, finally beginning to understand that everything he thought he knew about the past few days had been built on lies. "Let me tell you what really happened," Nalnish said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years settling disputes and seeking justice for those who couldn't fight for themselves. "While your son was away on business, these two people cornered his wife in her own kitchen." Eleanor's face went pale, but she tried to maintain her composure. "That's completely untrue. We were simply trying to have a conversation with Maria about her future, and she became violent and—" "Silence," Nalnish commanded, and the single word carried such power that Eleanor's mouth snapped shut immediately. You will have your chance to speak, but first you will listen to the truth. Benjamin puffed up his chest, trying to regain some authority. I don't know who you think you are, but you can't come onto our son's property and ... Your son's property? Nalnish interrupted, her eyebrows rising. This land belongs to Carlos and Maria together. You are guests here, and poor guests at that, since you have violated every law of hospitality and decency. She turned to address Carlos directly. Your parents waited until you were gone because they knew what they planned to do was wrong. They trapped your wife in the kitchen where she couldn't escape. Then they held her down while they cut her hair with scissors, destroying something that took years to grow and held deep meaning for her. Carlos looked at his parents with growing horror. Is this true? Did you really cut Maria's hair? Eleanor tried to justify their actions. It was for her own good, Carlos. We were trying to help her understand that she needed to look more civilized, more appropriate for... You cut off her hair against her will, Nalnish stated flatly. But that wasn't enough for you, was it? You also took ash from the fireplace and dirt from the garden, and you rubbed it into her face while she cried and begged you to stop. Maria watched as understanding dawned in Carlos's eyes. She could see him remembering how she had looked when they first met, how proud she had been of her long, beautiful hair. She could see him imagining the terror and humiliation she must have felt during the attack. They told me you had gone crazy, Carlos said quietly, his voice full of shock and growing anger. They said you attacked them and ran away screaming. Into the night. The only screaming your wife did was when they were destroying her dignity, Nalnish replied. And she didn't attack anyone. She fled into the desert to escape further harm, even though she could have died out there in the darkness. Benjamin tried one more time to control the narrative. You're only hearing one side of the story. Maria obviously told this woman lies to gain sympathy. You know how these people can be. They're always playing the victim when... Nalnish moved so quickly that Benjamin didn't have time to react. She was suddenly standing directly in front of him, towering over his shorter, heavier frame. Her presence was so intimidating that he stumbled backward and nearly fell. These people? Nalnish repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. What exactly? Do you mean by these people? Benjamin's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He had been caught using the same racist language that had driven their attack on Maria, and now he was face to face with someone who wouldn't tolerate such hatred. I didn't mean ... Benjamin stammered. You meant exactly what you said, Nalnish replied. You believe that people like Maria and me are somehow less than human, less deserving of respect and dignity. That's why you thought you had the right to attack her in her own home. Eleanor tried to come to her husband's defense. We were only trying to protect our son from making a terrible mistake. Marriage should be between people of the same background, the same race? The same. Race? Nalnish turned her attention to Eleanor, and the older woman shrank back from the fire in her eyes. Let me tell you about race. Let me tell you about the people who lived on this land for thousands of years before your people arrived. Nalnish gestured to the desert landscape around them. This entire territory was home to Apache, Navajo, and other tribes long before any white person set foot here. We built communities, raised families, and lived in harmony with this harsh but beautiful land. She pointed directly at Eleanor and Benjamin. Your people came here as invaders. You took our land, killed our children, and tried to destroy our culture. And now you have the nerve to stand on stolen ground and claim that you are superior to the woman who welcomed you into her home with kindness and respect? Carlos was staring at his parents as if seeing them for the first time. You really did this, didn't you? You really attacked Maria and then lied to me about it. Eleanor's composure finally cracked completely. Carlos, you have to understand. We did it for you. That woman was holding you back from your true potential. You could have a real life back in Boston, with a proper wife from a good family. A proper wife? Carlos's voice was rising with anger. Maria is my wife. She's the woman I chose to marry, the woman I love. How dare you attack her and then try to convince me it was for my own good? Benjamin made one last desperate attempt to justify their actions. Son, you're young and confused. You don't understand what's best for your future. We only wanted to. You wanted to destroy my marriage, Carlos interrupted. You wanted to hurt the woman I love because she doesn't look like you or talk like you. You're the ones who are confused. If you think that makes you better than her. Nalnish watched this exchange with satisfaction. Her plan was working. By forcing the truth into the open, she was making it impossible for Eleanor and Benjamin to hide behind their lies and justifications. Now comes the important question, Nalnish said, addressing Carlos directly. What are you going to do about it? Your parents committed a serious crime against your wife? They assaulted her, humiliated her, and drove her from her home. In my culture, such actions demand justice. The yard fell silent except for the sound of wind blowing through the desert brush. Everyone understood that this was the moment of truth. Carlos had to choose between his parents and his wife, between the easy path of forgiveness and the harder path of holding people accountable for their actions. Eleanor and Benjamin looked at their son with desperate hope, believing that blood would be thicker than water, that family loyalty would overcome everything else. Maria stood quietly beside Nalnish, her heart racing as she waited to learn what kind of man she had married. Carlos looked at each person in turn, his parents who had raised him, his wife who had been brutalized, and the imposing Apache woman who had brought the truth to light. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and determined. Justice, he said simply. Maria deserves justice. The word justice hung in the desert air like thunder before a storm. Eleanor and Benjamin stared at their son in shock, unable to believe that he was choosing his Mexican wife over his own blood family. They had been so certain that their years of influence and authority would outweigh any temporary feelings Carlos might have for Maria. Carlos, Eleanor said, her voice trembling with disbelief and rising panic. You can't be serious. We're your parents. We traveled all this way to help you, to save you from making the biggest mistake of your life. But Carlos had moved to stand beside Maria, and for the first time in weeks she felt truly protected. She could see the determination in his eyes, the way his jaw was set with resolve. This was the man she had fallen in love with, the one who had been slowly disappearing under his parents' constant pressure and criticism. The biggest mistake of my life, Carlos repeated slowly, would be allowing anyone to hurt my wife and get away with it, even if those people are my own parents. Benjamin's face turned red with rage and humiliation. He had built his entire identity around being respected and obeyed, and now his own son was defying him in front of strangers. You ungrateful boy. After everything we've done for you, everything we've sacrificed to give you opportunities, this is how you repay us. Nalnish stepped forward, her presence reminding everyone that this wasn't just a family argument. This was about justice, about right and wrong, about holding people accountable for their actions regardless of their social status or family connections. The choice is simple, Nalnish said, addressing Carlos but speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. You can stand with those who commit violence against innocent people, or you can stand with those who seek justice and protection for the vulnerable. Eleanor began to cry, but they weren't tears of remorse or understanding. They were tears of frustration and self-pity, the tears of someone who couldn't comprehend why their actions had consequences. We were only trying to protect you, she sobbed. That woman has filled your head with ideas that will ruin your future. You could have everything back in Boston, money, respect, a position in society. Instead, you're choosing to waste your life in this godforsaken desert with someone who will never be accepted in proper circles. Maria felt the familiar sting of those words, but this time they didn't have the same power to hurt her. Standing beside Nalnish and seeing the support in Carlos's eyes, she realized that Eleanor's opinion didn't define her worth. The proper circles Eleanor talked about were filled with people who thought cruelty was acceptable as long as it was directed at those they considered beneath them. Let me tell you what proper circles really are, Nalnish said, her voice cutting through Eleanor's sobs. Proper circles are communities where people protect each other instead of attacking the weak. Proper circles are places where a person's character matters more than the color of their skin or the accent in their voice. She gestured toward Maria and Carlos. These two young people have built something real here. They work hard, they treat their neighbors with respect, and they've created a home filled with love. That's worth more than all the money and social position in Boston. Benjamin made one final attempt to regain control of the situation. Carlos, if you side against us now, don't expect any inheritance. Don't expect any help from the family when times get hard. You'll be cut off completely, left to struggle in this wilderness with nothing but the clothes on your back. The threat was meant to frighten Carlos into submission, to remind him of everything he would lose by choosing Maria over his family's wealth and influence. For a moment, silence stretched across the yard as everyone waited to see how he would respond to this ultimatum. Carlos looked at his parents for a long moment, and Maria could see sadness in his eyes. Despite everything they had done, he still loved them and wished things could be different. But love without respect and accountability wasn't really love at all. It was just enabling bad behavior to continue. I never wanted your money, Carlos said quietly. I came west to build my own life, to become my own man. If the price of your support is allowing my wife to be attacked and humiliated, then I don't want anything from you. Eleanor gasped as if she had been physically struck. You're choosing her over your own family. I'm choosing what's right over what's easy, Carlos replied. Maria is my family now. She's the person I've chosen to build a life with, and anyone who can't respect the choice has no place in our home. Nalnish nodded approvingly. This was the moment she had been working toward, the moment when Carlos would have to decide what kind of man he really was. She had seen too many situations where family loyalty was used to excuse terrible behavior, where people looked the other way rather than confront uncomfortable truths. There are consequences for what you did, Nalnish continued, turning back to Eleanor and Benjamin. In my culture, when someone attacks another person in their own home, the entire community comes together to ensure justice is served. Benjamin tried to bluster again. This isn't your culture. This is America, and we have laws here. You can't just— You're right, Nalnish interrupted. This is America, and American law says that what you did to Maria was assault. You held her against her will, you cut her hair without permission, and you covered her face with dirt and ash. Any sheriff in this territory would arrest you for those crimes. The legal implications hit Eleanor and Benjamin like a bucket of cold water. They had been so focused on their racial superiority and family authority that they hadn't considered that their actions might actually be illegal. In their minds, they had the right to do whatever was necessary to control their son's life, even if it meant attacking his wife. However, Nalnish continued, Maria has the right to decide what kind of justice she wants. She could have you arrested and put in jail. She could demand financial compensation for the trauma you caused, or ... She paused, letting the word hang in the air while everyone waited to hear what alternative she might offer. Or you could acknowledge what you did, apologize sincerely, and promise to treat Maria with the respect she deserves as Carlos's wife. And as a human being, you could choose to learn from this experience instead of being destroyed by it. Maria looked at Eleanor and Benjamin, these people who had caused her so much pain and humiliation. Part of her wanted to see them punished, to watch them face the same kind of powerlessness and fear they had forced on her. But another part of her, the part that had been raised to value family and forgiveness, wondered if there might be a chance for healing. The choice is yours, Nalnish said to Eleanor and Benjamin. You can continue to be the kind of people who attack others out of hatred and fear, or you can choose to become better. But understand this, if you choose to stay in this house, if you choose to remain part of this family, it will be on Maria's terms, not yours. Eleanor and Benjamin looked at each other, then at their son, then at the woman they had tried so hard to destroy. They were facing the hardest choice of their lives, the choice between their pride and their family, between their prejudices and their love for their son. The desert wind blew softly around them as everyone waited to see what Eleanor and Benjamin would choose, and whether this broken family could ever find a way to heal. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Eleanor and Benjamin stood there looking defeated and smaller than they had ever appeared before. All their wealth, education, and social status couldn't protect them from the simple truth that they had done something terrible to an innocent woman. Eleanor was the first to break. The tears that had been tears of self-pity slowly transformed into something deeper and more genuine. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, she really looked at Maria, not as an obstacle to be removed or a problem to be solved, but as a person who had been hurt. Eleanor started, then stopped. The words seemed to stick in her throat like they were too foreign for her to speak. She had spent so many years believing in her own superiority that admitting wrongdoing felt like tearing down everything she thought she knew about herself. Maria watched Eleanor struggle and felt something unexpected, compassion. Not for the cruel woman who had attacked her, but for the human being who was clearly wrestling with the hardest moment of her life. Maria understood what it felt like to have your world turned upside down, to discover that everything you believed about yourself might be wrong. "I was wrong," Eleanor finally whispered, the words so quiet that everyone had to strain to hear them. "What we did to you was wrong." Benjamin looked at his wife in shock. He had expected her to continue fighting, to refuse to admit any fault. But seeing Eleanor's breakdown seemed to crack something inside him too. His shoulders sagged and the angry red color drained from his face. "We were afraid," he said, his voice hoarse and tired. "Afraid that Carlos was throwing his life away, afraid that people back home would judge us for having a Mexican daughter-in-law. We thought if we could make you leave, everything would go back to the way it was supposed to be." Nalnish listened to these admissions with a stern expression. She had heard many apologies over the years, and she knew the difference between words spoken to avoid punishment and words that came from genuine understanding. "Fear is not an excuse for cruelty," she said firmly. "Many people are afraid of what they don't understand, but most of them don't respond by attacking innocent people in their own homes." Carlos stepped closer to his parents, and Maria could see the pain in his eyes. Despite everything they had done, they were still his parents, and watching them face the consequences of their actions was hard for him. "Why couldn't you just try to get to know her?" Carlos asked, his voice full of hurt and confusion. "Maria is kind, hardworking, and she makes me happy. If you had given her a chance, you might have seen what I see in her." Eleanor looked at Maria again, this time with eyes that seemed to really see her. "You're right," she said. "We never gave you a chance. We decided what we thought about you before we even met you, and nothing you did would have changed our minds." Benjamin nodded slowly. "We came here expecting to find exactly what we found, or what we thought we found. We were looking for reasons to disapprove of you instead of reasons to welcome you into our family." Maria felt Carlos squeeze her hand, and she drew strength from his touch. This was the moment she had to decide what kind of person she wanted to be. She could demand the harshest punishment, could make Eleanor and Benjamin pay for every moment of pain and humiliation they had caused her, or she could choose a different path. "When I first met Carlos," Maria said, her voice steady and clear, "he told me about his family back east. He said you were intelligent, educated people who had worked hard to build a good life. He was proud of you." Eleanor and Benjamin looked surprised. They had expected anger, demands for justice, maybe even hatred. They hadn't expected to hear about their son's love and pride for them. "I wanted to meet you because Carlos loved you," Maria continued. "I hoped we could become a real family together. When you arrived, I tried to welcome you with the same warmth Carlos had always shown me." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "What you did to me was terrible. You hurt me in ways that will take a long time to heal. But I don't want to become the kind of person who returns cruelty with cruelty." Nalnish watched Maria with approval and pride. This young woman had found her strength not in revenge, but in choosing to be better than those who had wronged her. "However," Maria said, her voice becoming firmer, "if you want to stay in this house, if you want to be part of our family, things will have to change completely." Eleanor and Benjamin nodded eagerly, sensing that they were being offered a lifeline they didn't deserve. First, Maria said, you will treat me with the same respect you would show any other member of this family. You will not criticize my cooking, my clothing, my accent, or my heritage. This is my home, and I will not be made to feel ashamed of who I am in my own house. Yes, Eleanor said quickly. Yes, of course. Second, Maria continued, you will learn about my culture instead of dismissing it. You will taste my food with an open mind. You will listen when I tell stories about my childhood, and you will understand that being Mexican doesn't make me less than anyone else. Benjamin nodded. We would like that. We would like to learn. And third, Maria said, looking directly at both of them, if Carlos and I have children, you will teach them to be proud of both sides of their heritage. They will know about their Mexican grandmother's recipes and their Apache friends' wisdom just as much as they know about their Boston grandparents' history. The mention of children brought tears to Eleanor's eyes, real tears this time, not tears of self-pity, but tears of hope for a future she had almost destroyed with her prejudice and fear. We promise, she said. We promise to do better. Nalnish stepped forward one final time. Promises are easy to make and hard to keep, she said. I will be watching. This desert is my home, and Maria is under my protection now. If you break these promises, if you hurt her again in any way, you will answer to me. The threat was clear, but so was the opportunity for redemption. Eleanor and Benjamin understood that they were being given a second chance they hadn't earned, and they seemed determined not to waste it. Over the following months, healing came slowly but surely. Eleanor learned to cook some of Maria's traditional dishes, though she never quite mastered the spice levels that Maria preferred. Benjamin discovered that he enjoyed hearing stories about Mexico and began asking Maria to teach him Spanish words. When Maria became pregnant with their first child, both grandparents were overjoyed and competed to see who could be more helpful and supportive. Nalnish visited regularly, always welcome at their table. She became like an aunt to Maria's children, teaching them about the desert, about strength, and about standing up for what's right. The children grew up bilingual and bicultural, equally comfortable with their Mexican traditions and their Boston heritage. Years later, when people asked Maria about the Apache woman who had changed her life, she would smile and say, Nalnish taught me that we are all stronger than we think, and that sometimes the best way to defeat hatred is to refuse to let it change who we are. The ranch prospered, built on a foundation of love, respect, and the hard-won understanding that family isn't just about blood, it's about choosing to love and protect each other, no matter what differences might divide you. And sometimes it takes a giant Apache woman with fire in her eyes to remind everyone what that really means.